Husband divorced his barren wife after her IVF failed. Unaware of her $30 million fortune, he divorced her after years of failed IVF treatments, calling her useless and unworthy of his name, then walked back into the arms of Sophia, the same friend who once stood by Grace's side during every injection, and whispered, "I'll always be here for you." He never knew Grace carried a fortune that could change generations. "Enough, Grace. You're nothing but a barren burden. Pack your things and leave. I refuse to waste my life on a woman who cannot give me a child." Those were the venomous words David Williams spat as Grace stood trembling in the courtroom, divorce papers forced into her hands, her dreams collapsing around her. Instead of defending her, he abandoned her. Instead of love, he delivered shame in the hour she needed him most. He believed she was finished, but what he never imagined was that the same woman he cast aside as worthless would rise with a power beyond his reach, a rise that would expose his betrayal, shatter his pride, and bring him to his knees. Sometimes the children you cannot bear become the vision that bursts nations. Sometimes the woman you treat as nothing becomes the storm that destroys your empire. This is not just another story of betrayal. It is the cry of a wife despised in her weakest moment, the scars of humiliation turned into strength, and the warning the world too often forgets. Never despise the broken, for they may rise higher than you could ever dream. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. As we step into this story, I ask from my heart, don't just hear her pain and scroll away. Subscribe now, and in the comments share where you're watching from. So Grace, and every woman betrayed, knows she is not alone. The sharp crack of glass shattering echoed through the living room. Grace Williams flinched as David hurled her favorite photo frame against the wall, the one that held their wedding picture. The glass rained down across the floor, a cruel reflection of the years already broken between them. "You've drained every cent on those useless treatments, Grace," David's voice thundered, his eyes burning with rage. 4 cycles of IVF. 4! And what do we have to show for it? Nothing. Grace's hands trembled as she clutched the hem of her faded cardigan. The bruises under her eyes told the story of endless hospital visits, hormone injections, and sleepless nights. She had sold her jewelry, emptied their savings, even pawned her late mother's necklace, all for the dream of holding a child in her arms. Still, every pregnancy test mocked her with a single empty line. Dr. Helen Carter, their fertility specialist, had warned them gently in the last appointment. "It may not be Grace alone. Mr. Williams, we should consider testing your fertility as well. Sometimes the issue..." But David cut her off with a bitter laugh. "Are you saying I'm the problem? Don't be ridiculous. Look at her. She's weak, barren." The word barren sliced through Grace like a blade. She lowered her head, her lips parting in a whisper no one could hear. "I tried, David. I gave everything." It wasn't just David's voice tearing her down. His father, Edward Williams, a stern patriarch with silver hair and a heart carved from stone, had made his judgment weeks earlier. "You are nothing but a barren burden to my son," he declared coldly at the dinner table, the clink of cutlery falling silent. "A Williams legacy cannot end with emptiness. David, you must think of the family name." The neighbors had picked up the whispers too. Evelyn Scott, the woman next door, often watched Grace from her porch with folded arms, muttering to her friends, "Poor thing, cursed from birth. She'll never give him a child." And through it all, Grace still clung to hope. She prayed quietly at night, begging God for a miracle, even as her body ached from needles and her spirit sagged under ridicule. She remembered one night sitting on the cold bathroom tiles staring at another negative test, while Sophia Turner, her closest friend, held her hand. Sophia's voice had been soft then, almost like a lullaby. "Don't give up, Grace. You're stronger than you think, and no matter what happens, I'll always be here." But now, as the glass shards glittered on the floor and David's fury shook the house, Grace realized her sacrifices had only carved deeper cracks in their marriage. Her lips quivered, her eyes brimming with tears. "David, please, don't give up on us." He looked at her with disgust. "Us? There is no us without a child." He turned away, his footsteps heavy, his silence heavier. And in the shadowed corner of the room, Unseen by Grace, Sophia's text message flashed on David's phone. "She doesn't deserve you. You need someone who can give you what you want." Grace didn't know it yet, but while she was fighting for her family, betrayal was already planting its first poisonous seeds. The one person Grace thought she could trust, her best friend, was about to become the sharpest knife in her back. The perfume hit her before the sight did. Grace froze in the hospital corridor as David leaned a little too close to Sophia Turner, her lifelong best friend. Sophia's laugh rang out, light and musical, her manicured hand brushing his arm as if she had every right to touch him. "David," Grace called softly, her voice raw from another round of tests. He straightened immediately, guilt flashing in his eyes before vanishing into coldness. Sophia, quick as lightning, wrapped her arm around Grace's shoulders, pulling her close. "Grace, there you are. You look so pale. Are you sure you're eating enough? I told you I'll always be here for you." The warmth in Sophia's voice would have fooled anyone else. But Grace noticed the way Sophia's eyes lingered on David a heartbeat too long. Inside, Grace's heart thudded. A friend shouldn't touch her husband like that. A friend shouldn't look at him like that. Still, she forced a smile, whispering to herself, "She's my sister in spirit. She would never hurt me." But she was wrong. Later that evening, Sophia sat in her lavish apartment across town, sipping wine as her friend Lydia Harris lounged on the couch. Lydia, bold, sharp-tongued, and hungry for scandal, grinned knowingly. "You're wasting your time pretending to be her shoulder to cry on. Everyone knows David's losing patience. Be smart, Sophia. Step in before someone else does. You'll be the true mother of his children." Sophia tilted her glass, watching the red liquid swirl. "She's my best friend, Lydia." "Best friend?" Lydia scoffed. "Grace is barren, and you know it. David deserves a woman who can give him what he wants. Why should you stay in the shadows when you could have his name, his wealth, his life?" The words sank deep, awakening something in Sophia that she had buried under years of smiling loyalty. She had always admired David's charm, his success, his power. And now, with every failed IVF attempt, Grace's world was crumbling, while Sophia's chance was rising. That same night, Grace sat alone in her quiet bedroom, scrolling through her phone. Old photos of her and Sophia, laughing in college, celebrating birthdays, standing side by side in wedding gowns, stared back at her. Her heart softened. She is all I have left. Surely she would never betray me. But while Grace whispered prayers of gratitude for her friend, Sophia was already typing a different kind of prayer into her phone. "David, you deserve better. She can't give you what you need, but I can." The message hovered unsent for a moment. Then Sophia pressed send. Miles away, David stared at the glowing screen in silence, his lips curled into a faint smile. Grace stirred restlessly in her sleep, unaware that the woman she trusted most had just opened the door to the betrayal that would shatter her world. Soon whispers would turn into public daggers, and the humiliation Grace feared most would not come in secret. It would strike at a crowded family table. The sound of a fist slamming the dinner table silenced every fork and knife. "You'll never give me a child, Grace!" David roared, his face flushed red with fury. The crystal glasses trembled from the impact. The family dinner had begun politely enough. Laughter, toasts, chatter about business. But the moment Grace reached for David's hand under the table, his patience snapped like brittle glass. Around the table, faces froze. Edward Williams, the stern father-in-law, leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into approval. "Finally, my son speaks the truth," he said coldly. "The Williams name will not be buried by a barren woman." The words hit Grace like thunder in her chest. Her fork slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the porcelain plate. Sophia, seated across the table in her elegant dress, placed a hand dramatically on her chest. Her eyes widened in false shock, but her lips fought to suppress a smirk. Beside her, Lydia Harris whispered something under her breath and stifled a laugh. Grace's vision blurred with tears as she looked around the table for one kind face. None came. Evelyn Scott, the nosy neighbor invited to dinner as a family friend, shook her head with a mocking sigh. "I told everyone in the neighborhood, didn't I? Poor thing can't give him children. What a curse." Grace's heart twisted. She wanted to defend herself, to tell them about the endless injections, the sleepless nights, the way she had begged God to fill her empty womb. She wanted to shout the truth. It's not all my fault. The doctor said David might be part of the problem too, but her lips stayed frozen. Speaking would only bring more shame. She stared down at her plate, her appetite gone, the roasted chicken and wine blurring together. In her silence, memories rose. Pawning her jewelry, signing over her savings. The bruises on her arms from IVF needles. She had carried the weight of hope alone, only to be called useless in front of everyone. Her heart whispered, "Why does love vanish when you are at your weakest?" The dinner continued without her. Laughter returned, now at her expense. Edward raised his glass in a toast. To the future, one not held back by burdens. The words cut deep, but worse was David's silence. He didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her. Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stumbled from the dining hall. Her chest heaved, her heart breaking with every step. Sophia's eyes followed her, a sly satisfaction hiding behind a mask of concern. She leaned toward David and whispered just low enough, "She'll never give you what you want." "You deserve more." David's jaw tightened. His hand brushed hers beneath the tablecloth, and as Grace collapsed against the cold tiles of the bathroom down the hall, muffling her sobs into her sleeve, the first whispers of betrayal began to take form. Not in shadows this time, but in public daylight. Soon whispers would no longer be whispers. A secret hand on the street, a shared laugh in the open. The betrayal was about to step into the light. The cafe erupted with gasps. Grace stood frozen on the sidewalk, her eyes wide as she stared through the glass window. There, in full daylight, David sat with Sophia, his hand resting boldly on hers across the table. They were laughing, leaning close as though no one else existed. Grace's breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't a rumor this time. It wasn't a whisper in a corner or a mocking laugh at dinner. This was betrayal, painted on the canvas of the open street. Inside the cafe, Victor Brooks, David's slick business partner with a love for drama, spotted Grace outside. He raised his cappuccino cup with a grin. "Finally, David," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you found a real woman who can give you heirs." The whole cafe turned to look. Sophia feigned surprise, but she didn't pull her hand away. Instead, her smile grew, smug and confident, as though she had won a prize. Grace's knees buckled. She clutched her bag tighter, her heart pounding. The world tilted. This was the same Sophia who had held her during her IVF tears, the same friend who promised, "I'll always be here." And now here she was, not as a friend, but as a thief of everything Grace held dear. Ruth Miller, Grace's quiet caregiver, who had followed her into town for errands, caught her arm just before she collapsed. Ruth's face, always calm, tightened with sorrow. "Come on, Grace," she whispered gently. "Don't let them see you fall here." But Evelyn Scott, the neighbor who thrived on gossip, had already seen enough. Standing near the bus stop, she cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "I knew it! Your husband's found a new wife already." Her laugh echoed as people gathered, pointing and whispering. Grace's cheeks burned. She wanted to scream, to storm inside, to demand an answer. But the weight of humiliation pressed her down harder than chains. Instead, she let Ruth guide her away, her tears blinding the path beneath her feet. Back home, Grace curled on the couch, staring blankly at the empty cradle in the corner of her bedroom, the one David had bought during their first IVF attempt. "For the baby we'll welcome," he had said. Now it mocked her, a hollow emblem of promises broken. She whispered to herself, "Why wasn't I enough? Why did love vanish so easily?" And while she wept, David and Sophia walked out of the cafe arm in arm, their laughter carrying into the afternoon sun. David didn't know it yet, but the first open betrayal had been witnessed not just by Grace, but by dozens of eyes. Eyes that would carry the story into every corner of their city. The betrayal wouldn't remain gossip for long. Soon it would march into the courtroom, and divorce papers would slam down like a final nail in Grace's coffin. The gavel slammed down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Judge Harrison's voice cut the air. Case number 2745, Williams versus Williams. Divorce petition granted. The words stabbed into Grace's chest like knives. She stood trembling before the judge's bench, her palms cold, the blood draining from her face. David Williams, once her husband, shoved a thick stack of divorce papers across the polished table. His eyes burned with contempt. It's over, Grace. You are nothing but a barren shadow clinging to my name. Across the room, Sophia Turner sat smugly in the back row, a silk scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She didn't hide her smirk as Grace's humiliation unfolded in public. Beside her, Edward Williams, the iron-faced father-in-law, nodded in satisfaction. Finally, my son is free, he muttered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Grace's legs nearly gave way. Her voice cracked. David, please, after everything, after the sacrifices. But David didn't flinch. Sacrifices? You drained our money chasing empty dreams. I need an heir, Grace. You gave me nothing. The courtroom spectators murmured, gossip passing from lip to lip. Some looked at Grace with pity, others with scorn. Evelyn Scott, who had somehow secured a front row seat, leaned toward her friend and whispered with a mocking grin, See? Even the law can't save her. Margaret Cole, the poised lawyer assigned to oversee the estate later, sat quietly in the corner, observing. Her sharp eyes softened briefly as they fell on Grace. Though her official role had not yet been revealed, she knew this broken woman's story was far from finished. As Judge Harrison stamped the decree, Grace's tears fell freely. The echo of the gavel marked the burial of her marriage, her dignity, and her years of sacrifice. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions about David's future, Sophia's involvement, and Grace's humiliation. David pulled Sophia close, flaunting her on his arm. This is the woman who will give me the future Grace could not, he declared proudly. Grace froze on the courthouse steps, her body shaking as the whispers swirled. How could the man who once promised forever turn me into a spectacle? Ruth Miller, her quiet caregiver, pressed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Hold on, Grace, don't break here. Not in front of them. But as Grace looked at Sophia's triumphant face, Edward's approving grin, and David's arm wrapped around the woman who had been her closest friend, her heart cracked once more. Her lips trembled as she whispered to herself, I've lost everything. Yet somewhere deep inside, a faint flicker of defiance stirred. Because what Grace did not know was that her story was not ending. It was only shifting. Alone and disgraced, Grace would soon find herself drowning in silence, mocked by neighbors, abandoned by family, and left with nothing but despair. But in that darkness, the first light of her destiny was preparing to break through. The door slammed shut behind her with a hollow boom, echoing through the empty house like a cruel reminder. Grace Williams stumbled into the silence of her once lively home, clutching the divorce decree in her shaking hand. The papers slipped to the floor, fluttering like ashes. Ashes of a marriage burned to nothing. She collapsed onto the rug, her sobs breaking through the stillness. The laughter that once filled these walls was gone. The cradle in the corner mocked her again, its polished wood shining under the weak sunlight. It had never held a baby, only dust and broken dreams. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She reached for it with trembling fingers, only to see a new message from her estranged cousin, Deborah Clark. David was right. Maybe if you had been stronger, things would have been different. Stop bringing shame to the family. The words stabbed deeper than any blade. Even her own blood turned against her. Grace threw the phone aside, curling into herself. She remembered the court, the flash of cameras, the whispers of neighbors. She remembered Edward's satisfied smirk. Sophia's triumphant eyes, David's cruel dismissal. The memory replayed until she thought she might lose her mind. The knock at the door startled her. Ruth Miller, her caregiver and only steady supporter, slipped inside with a quiet step. Ruth was in her 50s, plain in appearance but strong in heart. She carried a pot of warm soup and placed it gently on the table. Eat something, Grace, Ruth urged softly. Don't let their cruelty starve you. But Grace only shook her head, tears spilling anew. Ruth, they've all turned on me. Even Deborah. Even the neighbors. I am erased, nothing but the barren wife he cast aside. Ruth's eyes shone with quiet sorrow. She pulled a blanket over Grace's trembling shoulders, whispering, "You are not erased. They don't see the end from the beginning. One day, Grace, they'll eat their words." But Grace could not hear hope through her pain. She closed her eyes, her mind drowning in darkness. Outside, Evelyn Scott's voice carried from her porch, loud enough for Grace to hear through the open window. Poor Grace, left with nothing. David made the right choice. She'll never rise again. The neighbors laughed with her, cruel echoes in the night. Grace pressed her hands over her ears, wishing the world would vanish. Hours passed in silence until she dragged herself to her room. The mirror caught her reflection. Hollow cheeks, swollen eyes, a woman unrecognizable. She whispered through cracked lips, "Who am I now? If I am not a wife, not a mother, then what?" Her knees buckled and she crumpled by the empty cradle, clutching its wooden edge as though it could anchor her. Her sobs shook the room. And then, a letter slid quietly under the front door, a cream envelope with her name written in elegant script. Grace didn't notice it yet, but that letter carried the key to her rebirth, a voice from the past waiting to lift her from the ashes. What seemed like the end was about to reveal a hidden beginning, a letter of destiny written long before Grace's fall. The pound, pound, pound on the door jolted Grace awake. She staggered from the floor, still wrapped in the blanket Ruth had left, her eyes swollen from crying all night. When she opened the door, a sharply dressed woman in a navy suit stood waiting, a leather briefcase in hand. "Grace Williams?" the woman asked, her voice firm but calm. Grace nodded, unsure. "I'm Margaret Cole, lawyer for the estate of Lillian Reed, your late aunt." Margaret extended an envelope sealed in red wax. "This belongs to you, and you must read it alone." Grace blinked in shock. Aunt Lillian, the same woman who had once called her a disgrace for not producing children? The same aunt who vanished from family gatherings years ago? She could hardly breathe as she took the heavy envelope into her trembling hands. Margaret's eyes softened. "Your aunt had a sharp tongue, but don't mistake that for a lack of care. She left behind something you must know." With that, Margaret and her young law clerk, Daniel Reed, stepped back, leaving Grace in the doorway, with the weight of mystery pressed against her chest. Inside, Grace tore open the seal. A letter unfolded, written in delicate cursive. "My dear Grace, years ago, I judged you harshly, as others have. For that, I am sorry. I, too, lived childless, and I know the pain of whispers, the sting of rejection. But I also know this truth. A woman's worth is not in her womb, but in her will. I leave you $30 million, not to flaunt, not to waste, but to rebuild your dignity. Use it to stand tall again and to help women like you, women the world calls barren, women broken by cruel words. This is my legacy to you. Carry it with strength." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Tears spilled freely, but these were not the tears of despair she had cried the night before. These tears carried shock, relief, and a spark of new purpose. She whispered, "30 million?" Her voice shook, the number too large to believe. Margaret returned inside with Daniel, explaining, "The funds are secure, confidential, but you must guard the secret. If your ex-husband learns of it, he will come crawling back, not for you, but for the money." Daniel, the young law clerk with sharp eyes and a brotherly smile, added, "We'll help you keep this hidden until you're ready to act. But promise us, Grace, don't let your past chain you. Use this to build your future." Grace's heart pounded. The same house that had echoed with humiliation last night now vibrated with hope. She clutched the letter to her chest, hearing her aunt's words echo. A woman's worth is not in her womb, but in her will. And yet in that very moment, a shadow crossed her mind. If David ever discovered this secret, he would not just beg for her return, he would destroy her all over again. Grace stood tall, the letter trembling in her hand. She was no longer just the barren wife cast aside. She was something else, something stronger, but destiny had only just knocked. Her next step would test whether she could rise beyond pain into purpose. With wealth in her hands and dignity stirring, Grace's quiet rebuilding would soon begin. But the louder David flaunted his new life with Sophia, the more their paths were bound to clash again. The pen scratched across the paper with fierce determination. Grace sat at her kitchen table, blueprints and notes scattered everywhere. Her hands shook not from weakness, but from passion. The passion to build something new. Her aunt's words rang in her ears. A woman's worth is not in her womb, but in her will. Foundation for Childless Women, she wrote across the top of the page. The title alone sent shivers down her spine. For the first time in years, her tears were not of pain, but of purpose. Miriam James entered quietly, her arms full of fresh files. She was Grace's old college friend who had resurfaced after hearing of her divorce. Once forgotten in the whirl of life, Miriam returned now with the kind of loyalty Grace thought she had lost forever. "You're really doing this," Miriam said softly, laying the files down. "Not for revenge, not to prove them wrong, but to help women who went through what you did." Grace smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "If my story can heal one broken woman, then all the nights of needles and tears were not wasted." In the corner, Ruth Miller busied herself with tea, her steady hands moving with quiet loyalty. She looked at Grace with pride, though she said little, the way she always did. Dr. Helen Carter arrived shortly after, carrying a thick medical report. The fertility specialist who had once been ignored now offered her expertise freely. She spoke with gentle conviction. "You were never alone in this, Grace. IVF failure is not shame. Many couples suffer, and sometimes the fault is not only the woman's." Her gaze hardened, as though seeing David in her mind. Grace inhaled deeply, as though breathing for the first time. The pieces of her broken life were slowly weaving into a new design. For hours they worked together, Miriam sketching organizational plans, Ruth arranging practical needs, Dr. Helen offering medical insight. Even Daniel Reed, the young law clerk, popped in with updates on confidentiality, reminding Grace, "Your ex-husband must never know about the inheritance, at least not yet." Night fell. Grace leaned back in her chair, exhaustion and fulfillment mingling in her chest. For the first time since the divorce, her house no longer felt empty. It buzzed with possibility, but as she stepped outside for air, her peace was pierced. Across the street, she saw Evelyn Scott, the gossiping neighbor, whispering with others. Their mocking voices carried, "Look at her, pretending to rise again. She's still barren, still worthless." Grace's chest tightened, but this time she did not collapse. She straightened her shoulders, her aunt's letter tucked close to her heart. Yet while Grace fought to build quietly, miles away, David Williams stood on a stage at a corporate gala, his arm wrapped proudly around Sophia. Cameras flashed as he declared, "My wife and I expect a child soon. The Williams legacy will thrive." The crowd erupted in applause. Grace didn't know it yet, but her ex-husband's arrogance was about to collide with betrayal he could not see coming. While Grace rebuilt in silence, David's pride and Sophia's schemes would soon spiral into dangerous games of power. Games that would shake the empire he thought was untouchable. The champagne sprayed into the air like fireworks. David Williams raised his glass high at the gala. Sophia Turner pressed tightly against his side. Cameras flashed from every angle as he shouted over the music, "To the future! My wife Sophia and I are expecting a child. The Williams name will live on." The crowd erupted with applause and cheers. Victor Brooks, David's flashy business partner, clapped him on the back, laughing loudly. "That's it, David. Finally on an heir. Investors love good news. Your empire will only grow stronger now." But behind the applause, whispers stirred. Paul Stevens, David's ruthless competitor, stood in the corner with narrowed eyes. His lips curled into a thin smile as he murmured to an associate, "He's building his house on sand. And Sophia? She's more ambitious than loyal. Perfect." On stage, Sophia placed her hand delicately on her flat stomach, tilting her head to the side so the cameras captured her best angle. Her eyes sparkled, but not with love. Inside, she relished the spotlight, every cheer feeding her hunger for power. David kissed her cheek proudly, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her smile. Meanwhile, Grace sat quietly at her small desk miles away, finalizing her foundation's mission statement. Miriam James, her loyal friend, leaned over her shoulder, whispering encouragement. While he flaunts your building, one day, they'll see the difference. Grace paused, her pen hovering. She hadn't heard about the gala yet, but she could feel it. A shift, a tightening in the air, as though David was pulling the world's eyes toward himself. For a moment, doubt flickered. What if they're right? What if I am nothing but his discarded shadow? But then she looked at the letter framed on her desk. Aunt Lillian's words, glowing like fire in her heart. A woman's worth is not in her womb, but in her will. Grace exhaled slowly and pressed forward. Back at the gala, Victor Brooks leaned closer to David, lowering his voice. Be careful, old friend. You've got contracts on the line, investors watching closely. Don't let anything shake their trust. But David only laughed, his pride swelling. I have Sophia. I have an heir. What could possibly go wrong? In the crowd, Paul Stevens smirked. He already knew the cracks in David's empire. Sophia herself was one of them. And later that night, as the gala lights dimmed, Sophia sat alone on the balcony with Lydia Harris, her cunning friend. Lydia's voice was low and sharp. He thinks you love him. He thinks that baby is real. But you and I know better. You deserve more than David's crumbling empire. You could have it all, with the right man. Sophia's lips curved into a secret smile, her eyes glittering in the dark. Maybe it's time I make a bigger move. Inside, David raised another glass to himself, drunk on applause, blind to the knife his mistress was already sharpening. Sophia's hunger would not stop at David's arm. With Lydia's whispers and Paul's schemes, she was about to begin a plot that could destroy the very empire David thought untouchable. The wine glass shattered against the marble floor. Sophia Turner hurled it across her penthouse living room, her chest rising and falling with fury. He paraded me around like a trophy, she snapped to Lydia Harris, who lounged on the couch with a smug grin. But all he talks about is legacy, 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 as if I exist only to carry his child. Lydia smirked, flipping her hair. And the joke is, you're not even pregnant. Sophia's lips curled into a dangerous smile. Exactly. And yet the whole city believes it. David believes it. I hold the power, Lydia. But why should I waste it on a man whose empire is already crumbling? The doorbell chimed. Lydia opened it to reveal Paul Stevens, David's sharp-eyed rival, stepping in with a confident stride. He carried a folder of contracts under his arm, his smile like a blade. David is careless, Paul said smoothly, laying the papers on the table. His business is leaking from every corner. But with your help, Sophia, I can strip his contracts, his investors, his empire. You'll walk away wealthier than you ever dreamed. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. And in return, Paul chuckled darkly. In return, I watch him choke on his pride. You get your freedom and your fortune. For a moment, Sophia hesitated. David had been her ticket to wealth and status, but his arrogance was suffocating. Now, with Paul dangling promises and Lydia urging her on, the temptation grew irresistible. Later that week, another door opened, this time to Anthony Blake, a wealthy investor with a reputation for discarding women as easily as he collected them. He took Sophia's hand at a private dinner, his eyes sweeping over her like she was already his possession. David is small change compared to me, Anthony said, his voice dripping with confidence. I can give you more than money, influence, power, everything you've ever wanted. Sophia's heart pounded. She smiled, sipping her wine slowly. And what happens to David? Anthony smirked. He collapses, and when he does, you'll be standing on his ashes, with me. Sophia leaned back, her silk dress shimmering under the candlelight. In her mind, David was already falling, his empire already broken. She would not go down with him. She would rise higher. But as she whispered yes to Anthony's offer, her phone buzzed with a message. It was David. Sophia, come home. I need you tonight. The contracts are slipping. I can't lose you now. Sophia stared at the words, a laugh escaping her lips. The man who once sneered at Grace's tears was now drowning in fear. And he had no idea the woman he trusted was the one pulling him under. As David's empire began to crack, desperation would drive him back to Grace's door. Not for love, but for the wealth he suspected she might be hiding. The pounding on the door rattled the whole house. Grace froze in the hallway, clutching Aunt Lillian's letter to her chest. Ruth Miller hurried from the kitchen, her eyes narrowing at the sound. "Don't answer, Grace. Whoever it is, they don't bring peace." But the pounding grew louder. "Grace, open this door!" That voice, her breath caught in her throat. David Williams. When she finally opened it, David stood there, his hair unkempt, his once polished suit wrinkled. His eyes darted nervously, but his mouth curved into a smile that did not reach them. "Grace," he said, softening his voice, "I just wanted to see you, to make sure you're okay." The lie dripped like poison. Grace's body stiffened, her knuckles white against the doorframe. "You made sure I wasn't okay the moment you handed me those divorce papers." David stepped inside uninvited, his cologne masking the sweat of his fear. He looked around, scanning the house with hungry eyes. "I've been thinking. Maybe I was too harsh. We had good years, didn't we?" Grace swallowed hard. She remembered the wedding vows, the nights of laughter before the IVF pain, the dreams they once shared. For a flicker of a moment, her heart twisted with old memories. But then the images of Sophia's hand in his father's cruel words, the courtroom humiliation, all of it flooded back. "You didn't think of good years when you flaunted Sophia in front of the world," she whispered. David's smile faltered. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I just want to know you're okay, that you're managing." His eyes flicked to the unopened files on her desk. "Tell me, Grace, how are you affording this new project?" Her chest tightened. He didn't come for her heart. He came for her inheritance. Daniel Reed, the young law clerk, arrived just in time, carrying documents for Grace's foundation. His sharp eyes caught the tension instantly. He stepped between them. "Mr. Williams," Daniel said firmly, "Grace has no business with you anymore. If you have questions, direct them through legal channels." David's jaw clenched, his mask slipping. For a moment, the charm vanished and the bitterness returned. "You think you're better than me now, Grace? You think you can rise without me?" His words spat like venom. Grace's hands trembled, but she stood taller. "I don't think, David. I know." The silence stretched until David let out a bitter laugh. He slammed the door behind him as he stormed out, the sound echoing through the house like thunder. Grace's knees weakened, but Miriam James, her loyal friend, caught her arm. "Don't break, Grace. That was not love returning. That was greed knocking." Grace pressed the letter to her chest again, her heart pounding. For the first time, she saw David for what he truly was. Not a husband, not even a man broken by loss, but a predator circling what he thought was still his. And outside in the shadows, Victor Brooks watched from his car, his phone glowing as he whispered to Paul Stevens, "It's true. Grace is hiding something. David was right to be suspicious." The whispers of Grace's secret were beginning to spread. Soon, David's allies and even his own blood would expose the cracks in his empire, and the law itself would begin to close in. The boardroom erupted in chaos. "Your accounts don't add up, David," shouted one of the investors, slamming a stack of papers on the glossy table. "Millions are missing." David's face turned crimson as murmurs spread across the room. Victor Brooks, the same partner who once clapped him on the back at Gallus, now leaned forward, his tone sharp. "You promised stability, David, but all I see is a sinking ship." David banged his fist on the table. "It's under control. My competitors are spreading lies." But his voice cracked, betraying his fear. In the shadows of the room, Paul Stevens smirked silently. The plan he and Sophia had set in motion was working. Contracts slipping, investors fleeing, doubt spreading like wildfire. Meanwhile, miles away, Grace sat quietly at her kitchen table, sipping tea as Ruth folded laundry beside her. For once, the silence in her house felt peaceful, not oppressive. But that peace was fragile, because rumors had begun to creep into her neighborhood. Evelyn Scott, the neighbor with the sharp tongue, leaned over her fence to whisper to another, "They say David Williams is in trouble. His empire's collapsing. Maybe Grace knew something we didn't." Grace heard the whispers but chose not to answer. Instead, she returned to her blueprints, focusing on her foundation's launch. Yet deep down, she felt a strange tightening in her chest, as though David's downfall was not just his own, but somehow tied back to her as well. Back in the city, Deborah Clark, Grace's greedy cousin, entered David's office with false sympathy. "David, maybe I can help," she said sweetly. "Grace is hiding something. I can feel it. Let me talk to her." David's eyes narrowed. He had suspected as much since his visit to Grace's home. "Find out what she's keeping from me," he ordered coldly, "and you'll be rewarded." But even as he plotted, trouble arrived at his door. Inspector Adam Johnson, a tall man in a dark suit with a reputation for honesty, stepped into the boardroom with two officers at his side. His voice was calm but firm. "David Williams, we've received complaints of fraud and financial mismanagement. Consider yourself under investigation." Gas filled the room. Victor Brooks quietly slid his chair back, already preparing to distance himself. Paul Stevens smiled wider, his trap tightening. David tried to bluster, his hands shaking. "This is nonsense. My company is strong." But the eyes around the table told him the truth. No one believed him anymore. That night, Grace sat in her living room, holding Aunt Lillian's letter again. She whispered, "Am I watching justice begin?" For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that the man who had crushed her might finally face the weight of his own cruelty. But hope came with fear, because as David's empire cracked, his desperation would only grow, and desperate men were dangerous. As contracts collapse and the law digs deeper, David's carefully built empire is about to crumble, and with it, the last fragments of his pride. The courtroom doors burst open as reporters swarmed like vultures. "David Williams under investigation for fraud," they shouted, cameras flashing wildly. David shoved past them, sweat dripping down his temples, his once proud stride reduced to a frantic stumble. Inside, Judge Harrison banged his gavel, the same man who had finalized David's divorce from Grace months earlier. "Order! Order in the court!" His voice carried a heavy weight. "David Williams, due to evidence of financial misconduct, this court authorizes the freezing of all your assets pending investigation." The words dropped like a bomb. Gasps rippled through the room. Edward Williams, David's father, clutched his chest in disbelief. "This can't be happening," he whispered hoarsely. "My son, the Williams legacy." Victor Brooks, once David's cheerleader, quietly slipped out a side door, his phone already buzzing with new business opportunities elsewhere. He would not drown with a sinking ship. Paul Stevens, standing near the back, allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Every thread he had pulled with Sophia was unraveling perfectly. David slammed his fist on the bench, his voice breaking. "This is a setup. I built this empire with my own hands." But Inspector Adam Johnson stepped forward calmly, his badge glinting under the courtroom lights. "And now you'll answer for how you built it." Across town, Grace received the news from Miriam James. The headlines flashed across the small television in her kitchen. "Williams' empire in crisis, assets frozen." Grace stared at the screen, her heart conflicted. Part of her wanted to rejoice. Justice was finally reaching the man who had crushed her spirit. But another part trembled, because she knew David's pride would not let him fall quietly. She whispered to herself, "He'll come back. Not for me, but for what I carry." Her hand tightened on Aunt Lillian's letter. Meanwhile, Edward stormed into David's private office, his voice like thunder. "You let a woman destroy you!" He spat the words with venom. "First Grace, now Sophia, and look at you, humiliated before the world. You are no son of mine." David dropped heavily into his chair, his face pale, his empire collapsing around him. Sophia was nowhere to be found. Her phone went unanswered, her seat at the boardroom empty. Panic clawed at his chest as realization dawned. Even she was slipping away. Judge Harrison's gavel echoed again, finalizing the asset freeze. Reporters rushed outside, feeding the city's hunger for scandal. And that night, in the dark silence of his mansion, David whispered into the emptiness, "I've lost everything." But he was wrong. He had not yet lost Sophia, and what she was about to do next would carve the deepest wound of all. As David's empire collapsed, Sophia's betrayal was about to cut deeper than any court ruling, and when she walked away, she wouldn't leave quietly. The front door slammed so hard it rattled the windows. David stormed into his mansion, his tie torn loose, his face twisted with rage. "Sophia!" he roared. "Where are you?" But the silence that answered him was deafening. No footsteps, no sweet voice, no false promises, just emptiness. On the table lay a note scrawled in elegant handwriting. "David, you were never enough. Your empire is collapsing, and I will not sink with you. Anthony Blake offers me more than you ever could. Don't look for me. Don't call me. You're finished. Sophia." David's knees nearly buckled. His hands trembled as he crushed the paper in his fists. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She wouldn't, but she had." Miles away in Anthony Blake's glittering penthouse, Sophia Turner reclined on a velvet couch, a glass of champagne in her hand. Lydia Harris stood beside her, grinning like a cat who had cornered the mouse. "You've done it, Sophia. You've traded a sinking ship for a golden yacht." Sophia smirked, her eyes glistening under the crystal lights. "David was useful, but Anthony is destiny. I was never meant to play second to Grace, or to anyone." But as Anthony Blake entered the room, tall and cold-eyed, Sophia's smirk wavered. He kissed her hand lightly, but his words dripped with ice. "Don't get comfortable. Women come and go, Sophia. I don't keep broken toys for long." Sophia's chest tightened. For the first time, fear flickered in her eyes. Lydia noticed it and quickly looked away, sensing her friend's gilded escape might already be rotting from within. Back in the mansion, David sat alone in the dark, the crushed note still clutched in his hand. His mind spun with images, Sophia laughing at his side, Sophia whispering promises, Sophia walking away with Anthony. His pride shattered like glass, and outside, neighbors whispered again. Evelyn Scott stood at her gate, shaking her head. First Grace, now Sophia. He thought he was a king, but he's nothing now. Nothing. Even Gloria Hill, a notorious socialite who once envied Sophia's rise, laughed openly at the scandal. "So much for the great Williams dynasty," she mocked at a dinner party. "He was left by both women, one barren, the other greedy." But while the city mocked, Grace sat quietly in her home, her foundation plans complete, her dignity rising like dawn. Ruth smiled as she poured tea, murmuring, "See how the tables turn, Grace. You planted hope in silence, while they planted betrayal in pride." David buried his face in his hands, his voice breaking into the night. "Grace, forgive me. I made a mistake." But the mistake was larger than he could imagine, and soon he would come crawling back to the woman he once destroyed. David's pride was shattered, Sophia was gone, and his empire was dust. But his path wasn't finished, because his knees would soon bend before Grace, and the world would witness her final triumph. The knock shook the house like thunder. Grace rose slowly from her chair, the sound of her foundation's opening ceremony still echoing in her ears. When she pulled the door open, she froze. There he was, David Williams. But not the man she once knew. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes hollow, his once confident shoulders hunched in shame. He fell to his knees on the porch, clutching her hands with trembling fingers. "Grace," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. Forgive me. Take me back. Please." The sight was almost too much. Grace's heart clenched, her body shaking at the memory of his cruelty. She saw again the broken photo frames, the courtroom humiliation, Sophia's mocking smile, Edward's cold words. She remembered every wound he had carved into her soul. And yet she also saw the faces of the women her foundation would serve. Women mocked as barren, women abandoned, humiliated, and cast aside. She was no longer just Grace, the discarded wife. She was Grace, the voice for every broken woman. Her tears glistened, but her voice was steady. "David, you divorced me when I was broken. You called me barren, a burden, a shame. You threw me away. And now you come back, not out of love, but because you've lost everything." David clutched her dress, his voice frantic. "Please, Grace, I don't care about the money. I don't care about the empire. I just need you." But Grace's eyes narrowed. No, David. You cared for pride, power, and Sophia, and when they vanished, you remembered me. But I am not the woman you abandoned. I am stronger now, and I will never return. The door creaked as she stepped back, her dignity radiating like fire. Behind her, Miriam James, Ruth Miller, and Dr. Helen Carter stood silently, witnesses to her strength. Margaret Cole, her lawyer, nodded approvingly, while Daniel Reed placed a protective hand on her shoulder. David collapsed fully onto the porch, sobbing into his hands. Don't leave me like this. Grace's voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of thunder. I don't leave you, David. You left me long ago. She closed the door. Moments later, the city erupted with headlines. Grace Williams launches 30 million foundation for childless women. At the ceremony, Grace stood tall before the crowd, unveiling the foundation's emblem, the once empty cradle, repurposed as a symbol of dignity and rebirth. Pastor Samuel Green raised his hands, blessing her work. This is not barrenness. This is destiny fulfilled. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers drowning out the whispers of the past. Even Evelyn Scott, once a mocking neighbor, stood silent in awe. And somewhere in the crowd, Deborah Clark, Victor Brooks, and Edward Williams lowered their heads in shame as the truth became undeniable. The woman they had despised rose higher than them all. Grace smiled through tears, her heart steady, her aunt's words etched forever in her soul. A woman's worth is not in her womb, but in her will. The story closed, not with vengeance, but with dignity, not with bitterness, but with justice, not with shame, but with triumph. Because for every woman broken, humiliated, or cast aside, Grace's story was no longer just her own. It was a warning, a light, and a legacy that would echo far beyond David's fall.